So the particular objectives of this study is to assess the warmth of welcome for immigrants and visible minorities in 17 Ontario cities outside Toronto, including 5 Northern Ontario cities, and they are Thunder Bay, Sault Ste. Marie, Timmins, North Bay, and Sudbury. They're part of the 17. Our goals are to identify targets and strategies for change and to assess policy directions and help shape anti-racism and welcoming community program interventions. How did we measure this warmth of welcome? We undertook a survey of local opinion leaders who are informed about local attitudes and organizational capacity, and who are people who influence the climate of the community and set the social and economic context for newcomers. So who are these opinion leaders? Well, they come from both the governmental sectors and the non-governmental sectors. They are elected politicians, they are senior bureaucrats, they are police chiefs, they are chief librarians, they are the heads of social service agencies, community service agencies, university presidents, college presidents, producers, newspaper editors, heads of community foundations. They are people who set the tone for the community. They are decision makers. They've got their pulse on the community. They understand what makes it tick. So we conducted, with Donna Dasko's help, and Donna Dasko was a former vice president of Environics Research, interviews with 10 opinion leaders from each community who were randomly selected from a sample of opinion leaders who indicated an interest in our study to participate in these interviews with Donna Dasko. So the entire data set consists of 170 interviews, 10 in each of these 17 communities. The interview guide touched on the following themes: whether the opinion leaders perceive that local and regional in these two-tier communities governments were interested in immigration at all, whether it is on the political agenda. It also looked at what their perceptions of community leader attitudes about the contribution of immigration to the community's economic, social, cultural, political, civic life and identity. We also asked the opinion leaders, is the local public interested in more immigration, not just the governments, but is this something that the public cares about and wants? We also asked them to tell us, does your community welcome newcomers and visible minorities, about their personal perceptions of the advantages and disadvantages of immigration, and whether they felt their community had the capacity to serve newcomers and refugees. This is relevant because we're hoping that it will help policymakers identify targets and strategies for program interventions to improve the warmth of welcome. We are also trying to account for local variations. Why are some communities relatively more hostile to it than others? And also to paint a demographic portrait of who these opinion leaders are. That really was a secondary goal, but at the end of it we asked about their racial and ethnic background because we want to know who the decision makers are. So these are the findings. We have more detailed findings across 17 communities, but we thought it'd be interesting to do a north-other comparison. So comparing the northern, the responses of people in the northern communities, the ones I mentioned at the outset, to those elsewhere in Ontario. And Scott, you mentioned at the beginning of the day about stereotypes about northern communities. Is Scott here? I happen to be one of them. I learned a lot, and it made me want to move to northern Ontario, frankly, because I have my own stereotypes going into this, and some of them were quite shattered. So in terms of municipal interest, government interest, overwhelming majorities of respondents in both areas, the north and elsewhere, felt yes, our municipal governments are interested in it, and largely based on economic labor market imperatives. It was rarely did they say we needed to enrich social cultural life or we need more political civic participation. It was all about what can they do for us. So very unidimensional, and that's across the board. But nevertheless, the municipal interest was higher in the north than elsewhere, which, you know, stereotype number one shattered for me. I was expecting the opposite. In terms of community interest, I think the numbers are telling when they asked, is the broader public interested in it? You have minorities and far lower percentages of respondents saying, yes, I think the broader public is interested in it. So rarely did they say they don't want it, they just said they don't think about it, it's not a priority, they don't care, and if they think about it at all, it's with some trepidation. We're worried about how it might threaten our jobs and our ability of our children to get jobs. And that was across the board in both the North and elsewhere, but a little more so in the North than elsewhere. In terms of perceived contribution of immigration to community life, we see again that respondents outside the North are more likely to say that community leaders would see as contributing to economic growth in their communities. In terms of social cultural contributions, there were really no great North-Southern differences. Large majorities thought this is great. It brings in new food choices, new cultural experiences, all that's great. But again, when it comes to the political civic contribution of immigration, and does it matter, does it contribute to our community identity, the enthusiasm is much lower. On the political civic dimension, minorities in both areas think that it's contributing to our political civic life. Not necessarily because they don't think the people who are there aren't doing a good job on the voluntary boards or in council if they happen to sit there, but for two main reasons. Firstly, they didn't see any efforts on the part of politicians in their communities to do outreach to try to encourage more political and civic participation on the part of newcomers. In other words, it wasn't a priority for the elected politicians in general, so they weren't bringing people aboard and they weren't that present. Or because, especially in the case of the North, they were just, the communities are still too small for them to have made an impact yet. In terms of community identity, in both areas there were sort of bare majorities of people who felt that immigration contributed to community identity, but in the North they're more likely to mention older immigration, the contributions of the Italians or the Ukrainians or the Finns or the Poles or the Hungarians, and very rarely did they mention new groups. They said it's just not there yet, they're not making an impact in terms of identity. In terms of the welcome, I really like this. In the North, a higher percentage felt that their community would be welcoming to them. And what came across there was, because there is this historical contribution of older immigrant groups to the Northern community, the Italians helped build us, we have the Francophone presence, the Finns, the Poles, and so on, that they have the compassion and the empathy to understand what it's like to be new and to try to fit in. At least that's what the responses they were telling us. But also, there were also a significant, about a quarter of the people in each area, North and elsewhere, also said there might be a mixed views about the welcome they would receive. And again, a lot of the responses were linked to fears that their children would leave because they couldn't get jobs and the type of threat this might pose to people who are there. In terms of visible minorities being welcome, a typical pattern in both the North and elsewhere is that far fewer people from visible minorities would feel welcome. And frankly, it was because the color of their skin, they stick out, people will stop and stare and point at them. And this were actually their responses. And that came out more often in the North than elsewhere. It seems that in the North, people are just more forthright about how they think. Maybe elsewhere, they're covered up a little more. But I don't know. Well, I won't go on. A female wearing a headscarf walking down a street in Northern Ontario invokes stares. But I've seen that happen in my own university too, but nevertheless, this came out. Again, the challenge is to deal with that. Obviously, visible minorities are perceived to be less welcome than whites. It's there, and it's in the North and elsewhere. In terms of capacity, again, the 54% of the Northern respondents felt that their community was in a position to serve immigrants. Higher percentage of respondents elsewhere felt their community was in a position to serve immigrants. On both counts with respect to refugees, there was a little less positivity, usually respecting housing shortages or lack of affordable housing. In terms of who the opinion leaders are, surprise, surprise, almost overwhelmingly, yes, male, well, no, not male, actually, there was a pretty good gender balance, white and Canadian born. So remember, this isn't just people sitting on local councils. These are also the heads of the community agencies, in the media, the librarians, the police chiefs, that diversity just isn't filtering through to the people who are making decisions. So how does the North differ, how do the perspectives differ from what we see elsewhere? And this is just a very rough summary of the qualitative evidence of 170 transcripts. I'm not doing these wonderful interviews justice because they're just so rich and wonderful. But in a lot of the Northern transcripts, the role of multinational firms and the multicultural workforces that they're recruiting came up as a positive, especially in places like Timmins, North Bay, Sault Ste. Marie. The multinationals that have in fact bought out formerly Canadian-owned companies were perceived to have contributed to a more positive, receptive environment for immigration. There's one exception, maybe Sudbury, where the, surprise, surprise, a little more mixed because of the Valley Inco situation and the dynamics. Yeah. Sudbury was unique, but elsewhere it was perceived as a positive. And a few examples were mentioned of some of the mining firms setting up interesting spousal support networks to help the spouses of the workers adapt and feel at home and not so lonely. And I thought that was an interesting best practice that could even be explored in a place like Newfoundland, where we have a lot of, and I've spoken with them personally, medical professionals who love St. John's, love their job at the hospital, their spouses just want to leave because they're lonely and nothing to do. So I thought that was something that's happening in Ontario that might be able to be translated elsewhere. Also, what was interesting for me is the prominence of First Nations issues that are obviously important, but are competing for the attention of local councils with the immigration mandate. So that is a fact. It's only just that it be that way, but it is competing for the attention. Also what came across was more people in the North said, we're friendly, we're open, we're used to moving in and out, and that is actually, that mobility, that openness to meeting new people makes us friendlier and more open to newcomers. Visible minorities were also more likely to attract attention just because there's so few of them, that they're more likely to get people looking at them on the streets. And also servicing religious minorities, that became a challenge. And not just non-Christian minorities, Jewish and Muslim, lack of synagogues or mosques, but even Greek Orthodox needs were also a factor in some communities. But there were similarities too, as well. All of the, in both areas, and I think this is really a shortcoming in the way local governments look at it. It's really a tool for what can they do for us economically. So I worry if your only interest in it is motivated by we need to diversify the economy, bring in more small and mid-sized businesses, boost our demographics, get people filling the jobs that we need. What happens when the economy turns south or the price of iron ore goes down and then you don't need it anymore and it's not wanted. But that's also a problem in southern communities as well. Also, the contribution of immigration to political civic life, regardless of whether it's the North or elsewhere, is really weak. A lot of the comments I heard about our elected councils really isn't doing enough to do outreach to encourage more people from newcomer communities to run for office. I've heard that in Peterborough, I've heard it in Barrie, I see it in Niagara, across the board. Also, mixed or negative community views about immigration are often linked to fears about job competition and change. These are themes that come out in places like Niagara and Brantford, but also in the North. And change in general. People are afraid of change. So that is something that needs also to be addressed in policy responses. And also, in terms of other similarities, public receptivity is linked to historical immigration, that is, communities that have, the past matters. Historical immigration are, again, in the present more likely to embrace it than those who have a weaker tradition of immigration from non-British areas of the world. And negativity in both areas, be it North and elsewhere, is often, or negativity or lack of receptivity to immigration is linked to stereotypes about visible minorities, and that was something similar that both respondents in the North and elsewhere had in common. In terms of suggestions for improving receptivity and improving the warmth of welcome, in the North, the main things that came out were housing or affordable housing were issues, access to ESL or FSL training. Those were the big ones. Informing the community, changing attitudes about the community came out as a major recommendation for improving the warmth of welcome. And then some of these more micro initiatives from businesses to help support the spouses of people coming into the communities was also something that came up. There were many other interesting suggestions, but I'll just leave it at that.